And we want to welcome Reverend Johnson with us, as always. Thank you so much for being with us today. He is our quarter-time minister, and we are always grateful to have you. So let me go ahead and stop the recording. Stop the screen. Come on up. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. Mind coming through in full fashion here?
Everybody online hearing you okay?
Yes.
That's good. And thank you so much for all of your work in getting us into this hybrid season that we're going to be entering. Wonderful for both in-person and online participation. So welcome, everyone. On March 12, 1987, the U.S. Congress declared the month of March as Women's History Month, a time to highlight the contributions of women to our nation. And so in line with this, I want to center our attention this morning on the Unitarian Louisa May Alcott, who lived from 1832 to 1888. And she's known primarily for being author of the March Family Trilogy, Little Women, Little Men, and Joe's Boys. On my 12th birthday, I was given the book Little Men as a gift. And I remember it as a page turner. I read it assiduously, very quickly, and I can't remember a whole lot about the book now, except for one thing. And that is the teacher in the book, I believe it was Professor Bear, did not believe in corporal punishment of students. And so if a student misbehaved, he would ask that student to take a ruler and strike his own hand as a punishment for that student. I couldn't believe that as a kid. I still find it hard to believe. But this was the actual process that Louisa May Alcott's father, Bronson, used for discipline in his own school, the Temple School in Boston, which he had in the 1830s. Bronson was a Unitarian. He was always poor and in debt. He was a vegetarian, an abolitionist. But very interestingly, in line with other Unitarians, he opposed the prevailing Calvinist doctrine that children were born sinners, selfish, corrupt to the core, totally depraved. And the role of parents and teachers was to break a child's will through verbal and physical punishment. It was a pretty grim world. Now, a common Unitarian belief was very different, that a child's will was certainly imperfect and undeveloped, but it could be educated to overcome selfishness, that we are not born totally depraved. So they believed that child rearing and teaching should not be based on fear, but on patient instruction and assurance of love. Doesn't that sound great? And I believe that's a core principle of Unitarian Universalists to this day. But so Bronson opened his temple school dedicated to these principles. He was a non-traditionalist in so many ways. He didn't believe in rote learning, that children were to just memorize and regurgitate information. He did not lecture, but he held conversations with his students instead of lecturing. His classroom had comfortable furniture in it and interesting pictures on the wall. And he asked the students to write about their life experiences. He even introduced sex education, which I'm sure was challenging to a number of the parents that sent their students to him. But it was a step too far when he invited an African-American young person to be a student. And so many parents withdrew their children that he had to close his school. A very, very sad time. Well, Bronson and his wife Abigail were dedicated to these child-rearing principles in their home with their 4 daughters. And I'm fascinated by their procedures here. They never would reprimand their daughters verbally. Can you imagine a parent taking on that discipline, they would write down their criticism of a child's behavior on a piece of paper. And the child then would put it under their pillow. I don't know if they're to dream or think about it. And then they would write a response to their parents' criticism. Fascinating. Fascinating to say the least. And they had a little box at their doorway of their home. And on a day when one of the daughters felt that they had fulfilled all the moral responsibilities that had been outlined by parents, they would write their name on a slip of paper and then make 3 check marks after it and put it in that box to signify that they had had a good day. Very interesting child rearing practices, to say the least. And fascinating as well is that they would give their young children complete run of the city of Boston, even at young age. When Louisa was 3 and her sister Anna were 4, they were allowed to roam freely in Boston. And one night after dark, Louisa was unable to find her way home, and she sobbed herself to sleep on a doorstep and was found by the town crier with her head pillowed on a big dog. Now, I'm sure her parents were just beside themselves with fear, and maybe they thought twice about their permissiveness. I don't know. But also at age 3, Louisa, who hadn't learned how to swim yet, went to the Boston Common and into the pond there. Many of you may be acquainted with that pond. I am. And she fell in the pond and was in the process of drowning when an African-American boy saw her struggling in the water, jumped in and rescued her. And her mother often said, "You were an abolitionist at age 3." Indeed, her whole family were abolitionists, and they were part of an underground railroad for a time. And actually, John Brown's widow lived with them for a while, the family. Louisa was not old enough to attend her father's Temple school, but she was old enough at age 10 to be part of her father's ill-fated attempt to create a back to the land utopia, the Fruitlands Project. And there were 16 people involved in this community. They agreed to be strict vegetarians so that they wouldn't take advantage of animals. They banned coffee and tea because these were fruits of slave labor or oppressed laborers. Of course, milk was out. That was oppressive of cows. They were teetotalers. And so I guess the only thing available to them in terms of beverage was water. They determined not to make clothing made of cotton because that was a product of slave labor. Wool, of course, was exploitative of sheep. So what were they to do? Well, linen was the only proper clothing that they could wear. And although Bronson claimed to believe in women's rights, his wife and 4 daughters did all of the housework and much of the farm work. That experiment at Fruitlands lasted 7 months. And Abigail was disgusted with her husband's impractical ideas. She claimed that he always went around with his head in the clouds. But the family, after that experiment, was particularly destitute of funds, and they were always in poverty and in debt. Louisa confided in her diary at the time of the failure of the Fruitlands experiment her wonderment whether earthly comforts were as terrible as her father had made them out to be. But her father, after this disappointment, took to his bed for several days and wished to die. Well, in 1848, the Alcott family decided to move from Concord to Boston. And Bronson planned to hold conversations in classes. Abigail planned work in an employment office for the poor. And Anna and Louisa would teach. And Louisa put in her journal this very interesting story. She said, as they were planning, she stepped apart from the family for a while and ran up a hill and addressed heaven, as it were. And she said defiantly, I will do something by and by. I don't care what. Teach, sow, act right, anything to help the family. I'll be rich and famous and happy before I die. See if I don't, she said to the Almighty. And of course, that's just what she did in ensuing years, doing whatever she could to help her family. At one point, after the family had gone to Boston, she went to Unitarian minister Theodore Parker and asked Theodore and his wife Hannah if they had any hints for her as to where she could get a job. And they gave her an idea of a family where they could maybe work as a governess to help the family. And she got a job teaching and sewing and working as a governess. And she wrote up her story after working with them for a time about her work in service to a family, entitled How I Went Out to Service. But the publisher, James T. Fields, rejected that piece and said to her, stick to teaching. You cannot write whatsoever. But she kept up writing and practicing and was able to sell her first piece in 1855 at the age of 23. Well, the Alcott family moved back to Concord in 1857. Actually, I've read various accounts. Some say the family moved 22 times over their years together, and others say it was 30 times, but they were constantly having to move, I suppose, because of lack of rent money, because they were so poor. But with her love of theater in Concord, she lost no time in forming the Concord Dramatic Union. And her theatricals involved many of the townspeople, and she livened up what she considered a dull town. Bronson continued to lecture and served as superintendent of schools in Concord, and she continued her work as a teacher from time to time. But she began to write pulp fiction. And I never knew this about her till I did this research. She had the pseudonym A.M. Barnard, and she wrote some real potboilers. One was entitled Pauline's Passion and Punishment. Another was called A Long Fatal Love Chase. They were known as lurid blood and thunder books, stories, sensational and passionate. And she published 33 of these pulp fiction books over the years. And they were very popular. They were found in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. And she made some good money off them. One year, she even made $600 off of publishing these books. Had any of you ever heard of that, or online, that she published pulp fiction? I had never heard that before. But she later in life, she was interviewed by a newspaper woman who asked her about writing this type of fiction. And she said, I think my natural ambition is for a lurid style, which I would have never expected about from Louisa May Alcott. But then the woman asked, well, why did you use a pseudonym? And she said, quote, how should I dare to interfere with the proper greatness of old Concord? To have had Mr. Emerson for an intellectual god all one's life is to be invested with the chains of propriety. So she did not dare let this news out in Concord that she had written those types of books. I find that fascinating. But to do her share in the Civil War effort, she served for a month as a nurse during the winter of 1862 and 1863 at a Union hospital in Georgetown, Virginia. But she contracted typhoid and pneumonia and almost died. She was nursed back to health with administration and part of calomel, which contained mercury. And it's believed by some that she suffered through the rest of her life from mercury poisoning. Others say it was lupus, but then it's been pointed out that use of calomel often led to lupus. So she did suffer from poor health after that experience. She published her experience in the hospital in serialized newspaper pieces. which eventually came out as a book, which was very, very popular. But of course, her most famous work is Little Women, which she wrote in 1868 when she was 36 years old. The initial idea for the book came from her editor, who asked her to write a book for girls, which he said was an expanding market. And she said, I don't know if I'm the right person for that because I was a tomboy. I always preferred hanging out with boys more than girls. But her family needed an infusion of cash, so she took on the project and worked on the book, coming up with 402 pages in a mere 9 weeks. And her editor offered her an interesting option. He said, I'll give you $1,000 right now for this book, or I'll give you a smaller advance of $300, and then you can have a royalty on each copy sold. Well, she took the royalty option, and that made her a fortune. I came across these figures, which I thought were fascinating. At her death, 18 years later, she was the country's most popular author and had earned more from writing than any of the male authors of her time. From the trilogy, Little Women, Little Men, Joel's Boys, she earned approximately $103,375 in the 18 years before her death. That was for US publication. She had additional royalties that poured in from Europe. By comparison, the prolific author Henry James would earn royalties from book sales, domestic and foreign, and in his lifetime of only $58,500. Herman Melville would earn only $10,044 from book sales during his lifetime. So she became a very, very wealthy woman. But Little Women, of course, told the story of 4 girls growing up in Concord in the March family. The father was a clergyman, at the time a chaplain in the Civil War. And the story portrays much of her actual life with her family. The protagonist, Joe March, is a tomboy, just as Louisa was. It follows the girls into early adulthood, and then a second volume took them into the years of establishing their own marriages and families. And then the 2 volumes became conjoined into 1 volume. When Joe marries at the end of the story, we realize that was part of the scheme of things in the book, but Alcott herself remained single throughout her life. Even though she wrote at one point, I am more than half persuaded that I am a man's soul put in some freak of nature, by some freak of nature, into a woman's body, because I have fallen in love with so many pretty girls and never once in the least with any man. But that was really brought into question because she did have a brief romance when she was in Europe, serving as a governess with a rich family with a young Polish man. And she detailed that in her journals. But interestingly, she deleted that from her journals just before her death. And her biographer, Martha Saxon, said that she had a tremendous crush on her teacher at one point, Henry David Thoreau. But Little Women was found suitable to age groups across the spectrum, and was a very, very popular book as a fresh and interesting natural representation of the daily life of the family. And it taught lessons which I think are still valuable today. Professor Rohan Maritzen of Dalhousie University outlined a number of these, which I have found to be true to my experience of the book as well. In the last 2 years, I saw both the 1994 film version of the book, starring Winona Ryder, and then in 2019, the film version came out directed by Unitarian Universalist Greta Gerwig, which is a tremendous portrayal of the book. So I want to outline some of the lessons that have come and are important to me as coming out of these films. Parenthetically, there have been more than 7 films uh, based on these books, on Little Woman. 5 of them sound and 2 of them silent. The first lesson is no matter how hard it may be, try to forgive. Remember how Amy, Joe's younger sister, in a fit of anger from something Joe had done, she burned the only manuscript of a book Joe had been writing. And Joe said that she hated Amy and would never forgive her. And then in that poignant scene, Amy almost died in a skating accident, and Joe realized that Amy was much more important to her than her cherished book. And she came so close to losing her sister. She sees that holding anger in that way, or holding grudge, can lead to bitter regret. An important lesson, right? To the importance of forgiveness. And the second, don't give in to jealousy. You know, the Alcott daughters, as well as the March daughters in the book, at times were yearned for the stylish dresses and the European tours and fancy parties of their wealthy friends, but yet they are reminded that they live much better than many other families who live in more poverty than they do, and that they should be grateful for what they have and for the comforts they enjoy. So don't envy. A third one is giving is as great a joy as receiving. Remember, the book begins with Joe grumbling that Christmas won't be the same without presents, but the girls get together enough money to buy some presents for their mother, and they get such joy and satisfaction out of that. And of course, they give their Christmas breakfast to a hungry, poor immigrant family nearby and receive a good deal of Christmas joy from that. 4, figure out what you're good at and then develop that talent. Remember how all the girls in the family develop their talent? Beth, the sister with musical talent, practices the piano whenever she can. Amy, with the artistic bent, spends time developing her sketching. And Joe, the literary sister, writes constantly. Meg focuses on the domestic arts, cooking and keeping house. And Beth, Lizzie in real life, unfortunately dies. But all of the other sisters end up using their talents during their lives. So develop your talents. And concomitant with that, she said, everyone, even young ladies, should know how to support themselves so they don't depend solely on a husband. So develop financial security. Don't depend on a husband. And 6, amuse yourself. Lacking money, the girls really didn't have the means for expensive entertainment, so they put their own shows on and they created their own newspaper. 7, avoid debt and be thrifty. Keep your expenses down so you aren't in the thrall of debt. And then 8, compatibility is more important in marriage than passion. Remember how Joe comes close to making a bad match, as her best friend Lori has fallen in love with her, and she loves him dearly, and he wants to marry, but she realizes that they are both too headstrong and impulsive to make a good match, and so she turns down his offer of marriage. And that was right at the end of the first installment of Little Women, and she, of course, wrote the next installment within the next year, and she got letters from girls all over the country say, marry Laurie, marry Laurie. But she didn't marry Laurie in the second installment. Instead, she married Professor Bear and established a good marriage with him. And then 9, of course, family should come first. Little Women reminds us that if we are fortunate enough to have loving families, we should appreciate and care for them. Family love is at the heart of the book, be it sisterly love, parental love, or marital love. Care for her family was Louisa's prime calling. When her sister May died, she cared for her daughter Lulu for 7.5 years until her own death. She cared for her parents when they were failing health. She purchased a home for them. She cared for Bronson, her remaining parent, who died on March 4th, 1882, just 2 days before she died from a stroke. Excuse me, not 1882, 1888, 2 days before she died. Her monetary success was dedicated to the comfort of her family, and she paid off all her debts, and she set up a trust, what she stated was to be used for her family after her death. What she considered to be her more serious novels, Moods, Work, and Modern Mephistopheles, did not get the public response of the March trilogy. And I want to say this last couple weeks, I've started reading one of her pulp fiction novels, not reading it, but listening it. I downloaded it in an audible fashion, and I just can't get into it. You know, I want to get into it, but it just doesn't have the charm and that which draws me in the way the March trilogy did. In addition to her literary pursuits, she gave her energy to the practical reforms of women's rights and temperances. She attended the Women's Congress of 1875 in Syracuse, New York, where she was introduced by Mary Livermore. She contributed to Lucy Stone's Women's Journal while organizing women to vote in the school election in Concord, the first time where women were allowed to register and to vote in any election in the country, supposedly. That was a question, the final question on Jeopardy a few weeks back. And Amy Schneider, you know, who won the 40 days in a row, that was the final Jeopardy question one day, and she was the only one to get it right. And I got it right too, because I knew the answer. I felt pretty good that I was as good as Amy that particular night. But she helped to start a temperance society, and she was secretary of that society in Concord. So she was very active in women's rights and the politics of her day. Daniel Sheehy has published a wonderful volume of recollections, of personal recollections about people who knew her well. And I'm much taken with Julian Hawthorne's memoir of her. He was a son of Nathaniel Hawthorne, and they were neighbors, the families. And he wrote, quote, "Honesty, goodwill, and common sense were in the breath of her nostrils. Penetration, too, and humor, surpassing the ordinary humor of women. An attitude of comedy in her daily conversation, both poised and inwardly sparkling. Isn't that a wonderful tribute? And I have to close with a story that Julian tells, which I find so charming. Julian was in love with one of Louisa's sisters, Abby. And that was well known by the Hawthorne family and by the Alcotts. But Abby and Louisa said to Julian that a distant cousin, is coming soon from England who loves Abby. And they mentioned this a few times during the month of March one year. And one day, Julian came home from school. He had just played a field hockey match. He was sweating and disheveled, but he was going past the Alcott house on his way home. In front of the house, there was Abby standing with this strange-looking man holding Abby's hand. He was dressed somewhat formally, sporting a mustache, a monocle, a hat, and a cravat, and he was talking to Abby. And so Julian walks up and he says to Abby, "Where's Louisa?" And Abby said, "Well, she's in the house, but I want to introduce you to my relative from England," who was holding her hand. Well, Julian, of course, was very jealous. And he was going to excuse himself, say, "I have to get home." But the English gentleman said, "Pray don't leave, dear child. I find you quite amusing." Well, Julian was outraged at what this English gentleman was saying, who was holding his girlfriend's hand. And he clenched his fist and went up to him. And just as he did this, the Englishman took off the hat he was wearing, and black hair tumbled down. It was Louisa. She and Abby yelled out to him, "April Fool, April Fool." Can you imagine? They had planned that April Fool trick for the whole month of March, and played it out perfectly. That's an aspect of Louisa May Alcott I never heard of. In her Little Women, Louisa has Marmee, the mother, say these words to her girls, which I believe Louisa firmly believed, and these are fascinating. If you feel your value lies in being merely decorative, I fear that someday you may find yourself believing that's all you really are. Time erodes all such beauty, but what it cannot diminish is the wonderful workings of your mind, your humor, your kindness, and your moral courage. These are the things I cherish so in you. I so wish I could give my girls a more just world, but I know you will make it a better place. So during this Women's History Month, I agree that through her writings and her whole life experience, Louisa May Alcott did just that. And so we honor her this day and seek to emulate her. So may it be.